Imagine this: a man on horseback, his fur coat billowing in the wind and eyes as cold as steel. They called him Genghis Khan, the kind of man who could reduce an entire city to ashes just because someone looked at him the wrong way. But this is not just a story about war or land. This is the story of one of the strangest conquests in human history. He did not just take over territories. He planted his own genes into millions of people, turning an entire continent into a living genetics laboratory. Today you might be sipping a Starbucks coffee in New York or scrolling through YouTube in Beijing, completely unaware that inside your body might be a piece of genetic legacy from this ruthless man. Not because he was handsome, not because he was charming, but because he killed nearly every other man in his path, ensuring that only he remained in the human gene pool. Before we dive into these chilling secrets, if you love discovering historical truths that never made it into your school textbooks, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. And be sure to drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. I find it incredible that all of us from every corner of the globe can sit together and unearth truths that have been buried for 1,000 years. And the story you are about to hear is no prairie legend. It is living proof of how absolute power can turn sex into a weapon, family into a tool, and all of humankind into lines of DNA code serving an empire. If you have ever thought you were special, I am sorry to break it to you, but you might just be one of 16 million men carrying the DNA of the same Mongolian guy who died over 800 years ago. No, he was not a rock star. He was not a movie actor. And he was definitely not a TikTok influencer. His name was Temujin, though the world knows him as Genghis Khan, the all-powerful CEO of the largest empire to ever rip through a world map. A man who could not read or write, yet somehow managed to stamp his genetic signature into millions of genomes without ever holding a pen. These days, when you take a DNA test hoping to discover you are a descendant of Queen Victoria or some glorious Viking warrior, well, sorry. The results often say you have 0.5% Mongolian DNA, which roughly translates to "Welcome to the Genghis Descendants Club." Congratulations, you are one of millions of accidental genetic copies. And no, this is not some wartime fairy tale about a king spreading love across the lands. There were no violins, no roses blooming on the steps. Just a shirtless guy on a horse, sword in hand, burning down cities and leaving behind more than just ashes. This is not a story about love. It is the story of a full-scale genetic invasion across an entire continent. Scientists refer to this phenomenon as post-war hyper-procreation. We, the black comedy historians, call it the greatest right swipe in human history. And no one swiped match more than the Khan. Why? Because he eliminated all competition on the app by literally wiping out the male population of the next city over. You did not need a census to figure out who the alpha male was. If you stepped outside one morning and realized there were no men left in the village, well, congratulations. The only man still breathing was the one on horseback outside your home. And he was asking your mother if she had a daughter. History tells us after every conquest, Temujin did not just take treasure, he took women too, and in the most literal sense of the phrase, expanding the empire. But this was not about pleasure. It was not the flirtations of some ancient playboy. It was a deliberate biological strategy. A strategy written in blood, etched into bone, and stamped onto the Y chromosome. Historians call it political consolidation through marriage. We call it exactly what it was: sex as a post-war weapon. Genghis Khan did not stop after victory. He planted his seed in every territory, both metaphorically and literally. These genetic heirs later became local nobles, governors, vassals, or argai in that region. Imagine being the defeated chief of a Central Asian tribe. Your warriors are all dead. Your people are terrified. Then the Mongols hand you a young Khan and say, "This is the seventh son of Genghis. He will now govern this land." You do not object, because you want to stay alive. This was not about raising sons. This was about rebuilding the entire human resource structure with DNA. It was how one man did not just build a military empire, but created a global biological network. You think Google has user data, Khan had living genetic data, riding horses, drawing bows, and inheriting loyalty via chromosomes. And do not think it was just women who were chosen. They were divided, assigned like the spoils of war. Some were princesses, some were peasants, but all of them disappeared from history, leaving only their genes to survive, hidden in the hair, the eyes, and the nasal bridge of their descendants. See, when most people sleep with someone for the first time, they hope to leave an impression. Genghis Khan left an empire and 16 million descendants. Not bad for a guy who did not have an iPhone, huh? Of course, some may object. Well, that sounds inhumane. Yes, absolutely. History is not a love song. It is a casualty report with a genetic logistics department. And Genghis was the first to use war to manage genes like a post-conflict control system. He did not leave monuments. He did not need songs of praise. As long as a strand of his DNA still lingers in the bloodstream of someone in the West, he has already won. And while Caesar was assassinated, Napoleon was exiled, and Hitler committed suicide. Genghis Khan died peacefully, untouched, his grave unknown. And when we ask, what did he leave behind for the world? The answer is, he left you, if you carry even half a strand of his DNA. Every time you hear someone say Genghis Khan has thousands of descendants, your brain probably flashes an image of an old man on horseback, silver hair, flowing, surrounded by grandchildren, like some nomadic Santa Claus. Completely wrong. Genghis Khan was no national grandfather. He was a world-class human resource strategist, and the resource in question was bloodline. This is not a love story. This is a genetic map turned into a power map. After every conquest, he did not just collect horses, gold, and silk. He took the noble women of each region not for pleasure, but to establish a genetic satellite network. Each child born was a mobile Mongol outpost, with local power, centralized blood, and loyalty passed down through the Y chromosome. You think his administrative system was based on laws, sure, but his post-war control system was based on descendants. Imagine you are a Persian warlord just thoroughly defeated. You kneel in surrender, sign a treaty, give up your land. 3 months later, your daughter is honored as Genghis Khan's 37th wife. A year later, she gives birth to a son. That child grows up speaking Mongolian, learns to ride and shoot, and eventually becomes a native Mongol ruling over the land of his own grandfather. You call it peace. The Khan called it post-conquest demographic management. Instead of stationing troops, he planted genes and withdrew. And if someone rebelled, the Khan did not send more armies. He sent a letter to the biological grandson already commanding troops on site. You see, Genghis Khan did not need to hold land to hold power. He just needed to leave behind his blood. Because blood is more loyal than an army. It needs no salary, no rations, and most importantly, it cannot betray its own gene. And do not assume all his descendants were born to queens. He had a system, high-tier wives, mid-tier wives, and what we might call campaign wives. Sometimes there was no marriage, just a bestowed favor. and with that, a new region received a genetic implant. This system spread across Central Asia, the Middle East, southern Russia, and even Eastern Europe. In each place, a small genetic branch remained not large enough to found a nation, but strong enough to remind the locals, we are still here, in your blood. You think he was chasing likes on Tinder? No. He installed himself like operating software, so that whenever a territory considered rebellion, the local leader would look up and see his portrait hanging on the family shrine. Historical records say that after major victories, Genghis Khan held ceremonies to divide the spoils. Gold, silver slaves distributed among his generals. But women he chose first, not out of lust, but because he understood the first one to plant the seed controls the narrative. There is a saying in genetic circles: those who survive in history books are not those who won, but those whose genes endured. And if you look at what Genghis Khan did, you will see he did not just redraw the map of the world. He rewrote the DNA sequence of an entire continent. Today, if you are an Asian man and take a DNA test, there is a decent chance you carry a Mongol marker. Even if you have never ridden a horse, never seen a battlefield, never shouted, "Long live the great Khan," you are still the descendant of a decision that was not yours. Now that is genius. Some researchers speculate that Genghis Khan's genes may have carried dominant traits: strong health, high fertility, low disease. That may have helped his lineage survive through hundreds of generations. But in reality, his gene survival was not biological. It was political biology. You think you were born by chance, maybe. But to the Khan, no one was born by accident. Every child with his bloodline was a chess piece, an asset, a branch office, a background program for an empire that collapsed but still haunts the global genome. The question is no longer, how many wives did he have? It is how many modern nations were shaped by the genetic policies of one man on horseback 800 years ago. And if you think that was just how things were back then sorry, you underestimate Genghis Khan's calculations. He did not act on instinct. He acted on vision. A vision so long-reaching, it is still running in the bloodstream of the modern world. We have talked about reproduction as a strategy, but that is only half the story. The other half is the nauseating truth: Genghis Khan's genes did not spread because he fathered more children, but because he killed off everyone else. This is not romance. This is genetic restructuring through selective extinction. In the Mongol world, you did not compete genetically. You eliminated other genes. No local males meant no descendants, which meant no one was left to write the next chapter of history. The result, the victor's DNA took over the local gene pool, like a virus that never needed an antivirus. You think this was random? Wrong. This was the standard operating procedure after every conquest. Imagine being a resident of Urgench, a magnificent Central Asian city, once a commercial center of the Khwarezmian Empire, filled with schools, libraries, public baths. Then one day, the Mongols arrive. No declaration of war. No offer to negotiate. They send only one thing in order to sterilize every man in the city with a blade. Within a week, the entire city became an open-air lab where the Mongols did not just conquer land, but erased the genetic records of an entire population. The women were kept. The girls were spared. The boys only if they were young enough to forget who their fathers were. That is how Genghis Khan's legacy spread, not because he sowed more, but because he was the only one left able to sow. In modern terms, we call this genocide. In Genghis Khan's terms, it was called post-war stabilization. You might say, well, it was wartime brutality was inevitable. No. Many other conquerors allowed local men to live as long as they submitted. Genghis did not. He did not believe in submission. He believed in erasure. He did not want his enemies to follow his laws. He wanted to rewrite the laws so that only his blood was legal. Modern genetic data backs this up. When scientists traced a Y chromosome lineage found across dozens of countries from Central Asia to Eastern Europe, they did not just discover a common male ancestor from 800 years ago. They discovered something far more chilling. There were no competing genetic lines from the same period. Not because his genes were stronger, but because every other gene line was wiped out. And so one man who once declared himself the wrath of God did not just destroy empires. He dismantled the DNA chain of an entire civilization. You see, victory was never just about the map. Victory was when no one remained alive to remember they had ever lost. In Nishapur, after the death of his son-in-law, Genghis Khan ordered the execution of the entire city. Historians record that over 100,000 people were killed in just a few days. Death was not punishment. It was genetic insurance. Because if even one man survived, he might father a descendant who remembered the pain. Genghis Khan allowed no heirs but his own. And to him, every child born without his genes was a seed of danger. In Baghdad, Mongol forces killed so many that the waters of the Tigris River turned black with ink from the libraries and red with the blood of men. That is not a metaphor. That is history. Erasing knowledge, erasing fathers, and starting over with the Khan's blood as the foundation. The question is no longer how many children did he have. The question is who else had children after he came through. That is why 16 million men today carry Genghis Khan's DNA. Not because he was charming, but because he sterilized an entire continent by sword. Cold, systematic. Not uncontrolled violence, but control through violence. That greatness, if you still want to call it greatness, did not lie in how much he conquered. It lay in the fact that he left the world with no other choice but himself. His genes were not selected because they were superior. They survived because all the other choices were annihilated. If that is not fascist-style biological legacy, then there is no better term for it. An empire conquered by the sword. An empire sustained by genes. And then, at a higher level, an empire operated by descendants who shared both blood and ideology. This is no longer just a story of Genghis Khan had many sons. This is the story of Genghis Khan created many powerful copies of himself. No one else in human history ever built a genetic political system with the same scale and precision. With every marriage, every child born, every territory handed to a descendant, he was not just replicating his DNA, he was replicating his governing operating system. You think he left behind children to carry on the name? No. He left behind internal control nodes. Each son was an executive branch. Each grandson a judicial branch. The entire empire functioned as one massive biological organism, and he was the central DNA. That is why the Mongol Empire did not collapse upon his death. It expanded further, split apart, and regenerated into separate khanates, all carrying the same genetic code. And here's the key: those khanates did not fight one another, at least not for the first few generations. Why? Because they were all the flesh and blood of the same man. Genghis Khan did not just design an empire, he used his own body as the blueprint for power. Take a look at the post-Genghis structure. The Great Khan, the central core of power in Mongolia, ruled by his eldest son. The Ilkhanate, Persia, governed by his grandson. The Chagatai Khanate, Central Asia, ruled by his second son. The Golden Horde, Russia and Eastern Europe, led by a grandson who called him grandfather. The Yuan dynasty, China, founded by his grandson Kublai Khan. Each region was ruled by a direct blood relative. No alliances, no elections. just hereditary governance through genetics. What do you see? An empire that functioned like a franchise network, but without contracts. Just DNA from the same testicle. It was like Apple, the same operating system running across different devices. Each operated independently, but everything was synced from a cloud server named Temujin. He did not just leave behind descendants, he left behind a cold-blooded algorithm for governance. Loyalty to your own blood. Dominate through genes. Expand through heredity. Neutralize resistance through extinction. And if someone fails, replace them with another grandchild. Every time the empire faced crisis, the solution was not to call a parliament. It was to search for someone who still carried his blood and was old enough to ride. That was not monarchy. That was genetic blockchain. No one could fake it. No one could override it. The system verified itself. Do you carry his DNA? Yes, step up. No, step aside. His descendants did not just rule. They became supernatural icons. In parts of Central Asia, even today, people revere Genghis Khan's descendants like deities because they are believed to carry the blood of power. Sounds mythical, it is not. It is biological political legacy. Genghis Khan invented a new form of genetic superstate, an empire where even when the map was divided, the genes stayed connected. You could replace a king, but you could not replace the blood. The story gets even harsher when you look at how those descendants were raised. From a young age, they were not pampered. They were sent into the military, made to lead real battles, trained in command and in reproduction. Yes, breeding true to the line was mandatory. No random romance. No marrying outside the gene pool. Which means that even after his death, his genes still controlled reproduction. Ask yourself, has any other leader ever governed his legacy from the grave by forcing descendants to maintain a pure, ruling bloodline? No, only the Khan. You see, history is not just dry numbers on a page. It is blood, it is tears, it is fragments of truth buried for centuries. And if you have followed me this far, it means you too have been pulled into this journey just like I have. So why not hit that subscribe button right now, and together let's unlock more hidden doors from the past. And do not forget to leave a comment. What shocked you the most in this entire story? I would truly love to hear your answer. You can buy health insurance, car insurance, home insurance. But Genghis Khan played at an entirely different level. He created a one-of-a-kind insurance policy in the history of mankind, imperial life insurance backed by living genes. The strategy was brutally simple. After every conquest, he left behind a piece of the spoils, his own biological son. Not out of duty, not to stay in touch, but to keep that territory locked inside a political ecosystem called my family. You think he left his children back home drinking fermented mare's milk, waiting to inherit the throne? No. He scattered them everywhere like genetic Wi-Fi nodes. Each territory a son, each kingdom a descendant. Not a crown prince, but a living representative of centralized genetic authority. Think of it as an imperial backup system. If a region rebelled, no need to send in armies. Just activate the standby descendant and the people would fall back in line, because standing before them was their own blood. Sounds like science fiction. It was not. It was battlefield protocol. In Persia, after conquering the region of Khorasan, Genghis arranged for local princesses to marry his sons. A few years later, the resulting child was known among locals as the Gentle Khan. Why? Because he belonged to both worlds, Mongol and native. To oppose him was to oppose your father, your mother, your homeland all at once. Who would dare? That was the tactic anchoring his genes directly into the opponent's society. And remember, he was not just having sons, he was planting agents, agents who bore his name, his blood, and most importantly, absolute loyalty to the center. You see it now, don't you? Most empires die from fragmentation, but Genghis Khan created a system that reconnected itself through genetics. In the Caucasus, Central Asia, even Eastern Europe, when political unrest flared, the people did not search for the strongest leader. They searched for the one who still carried his blood. He might be weak, but if he bore the genes of Genghis Khan, that alone was reason enough to unify the factions. Which means his gene became political currency. If you had it, you ruled. If you did not, you were ruled. Even in the 17th century, 300 years after his death in Bukhara, a newly emerging king had to prove he was a descendant of Genghis Khan in order to be accepted. Not because people remembered the Khan, but because only his genes still had the power to certify a true sovereign. You think he built an empire and then died? He built an empire and left behind self-operating copies capable of riding horses, ruling regions, and reproducing further. In every land, his descendants acted as both ambassadors and biological hostages. If the people rebelled, they would have to kill someone who carried his blood. Think that is easy. You are not just killing a local ruler. You are killing the son of a man people believed to be a divine force. And if you did kill him, there were 300 more across Asia ready to come collect the blood debt. This was soft genetic deterrence. No emails, no economic sanctions. As long as that blood still flowed in that territory, the people would think twice. You see it clearly now. While other kings relied on divine authority, money, or religion to hold on to power, Genghis Khan only needed sons. And he had so many, there was one for every region. No courtship, no elections, just this. As long as my blood remains here, this land has not left my grasp. This kind of insurance had no cancellation clause, no renewal needed, and no one could compete. You might steal the throne, but if the people knew you did not carry Khan blood, you were still an impostor. Genghis Khan did not need to be alive to rule. He just needed one descendant still breathing on that land. That was a post-war strategy made of sperm. If you have ever watched a movie that portrayed Genghis Khan as a wild warrior, but a hopeless romantic, gazing thoughtfully at the stars from horseback, smiling at the kidnapped princess like it was love at first sight, turn it off. This is not a love story. This is a human production system with minimal cost and maximum control. You thought he was lustful? No. He was obsessed with building a labor force wired for loyalty. And if we are being honest, Genghis Khan was not a legendary womanizer. He was the founding father of political reproductive engineering. No first dates, no candlelight, just a newly conquered city, a freshly captured princess, and the system went into motion. Merge genes into local nobility. Produce a son with both Mongol and native blood. Train him to lead as a local ruler with a centralized soul. It was a formula to manufacture rulers preloaded with genetic authority. And that was not all. Genghis even categorized his wives the way corporations classify assets. High-tier wives, Mongol nobility, their sons could become great Khans. Foreign wives, princesses from conquered territories, their sons would rule as regional Khans. Spoils of war, all others used to expand gene coverage. With every campaign, he brought home hundreds of women, but only a few were married. The rest distributed as biological assets with strategic potential. You think that sounds barbaric? To him, it was logistics. Mongol records even detail how women were cataloged by region, assessed for suitability, some for breeding warriors, others as diplomatic spouses. Genghis did not write poetry. He wrote reproductive structure with the strategy of a megacorp. If you work in marketing, study this move. He takes a region, has his son marry the local princess. They have a mixed blood child. The locals accept it because he's our grandson. The region stabilizes without a single stationed soldier. A PR campaign powered by sperm. Costs zero. Return 3 generations of rule, no war needed. And do not think every man back then could do the same. Not a chance. Genghis monopolized reproduction. Anyone who wanted to marry noble blood needed permission. Anyone who wanted to produce children within the elite bloodline had to be approved. You think royal power is about sitting on a throne? No. To him, royal power was the ability to control who was allowed to reproduce. This was not historical voyeurism. This was biological power management. We call it handcrafted eugenics. No labs, no CRISPR. Just blades, horses, and a philosophy colder than the steppe wind. The winner gets to reproduce. The loser is erased from history. This system was brutal but effective. No one outside his bloodline had a chance to rule. His descendants were programmed from birth, dominate and replicate. His blood became the benchmark for power, morality, and even in some places, religion. That is why even centuries later, you did not need a certificate to rule. Just say, I am a descendant of Genghis Khan. And that was enough. The people believed. The soldiers followed. The land submitted. Meaning the conquest by sword lasted a few weeks, but the conquest by genes lasted for centuries. And in the end, the most terrifying part is not how many people he killed. It is how many of us today exist because of a reproductive plan no one consented to 800 years ago. No need for statues. No need for songs of praise. As long as even a trace of his DNA remains in someone's blood, Genghis Khan never really left his empire. There is something strange about genetic science. You can live, love, have children, pay taxes, go on vacation in Cancun, and never know that your DNA carries a fracture from history. More specifically, a strand of genetic code was embedded in you in the 13th century by a man in a fur coat, speaking Mongolian, who launched the largest power cloning campaign in human history. Not with a signature, not with a will, but with a Y chromosome. Today, 16 million men have been confirmed to carry the same DNA segment, all tracing back to a single male ancestor who lived around 800 years ago in Mongolia. And if you are a man living anywhere from Central Asia to Eastern Europe, and your last name is not Nguyen, then odds are you may carry his name without even knowing it. Welcome to the club of unintentional descendants of Genghis Khan. There is no initiation, no welcome gift, just one cold fact: you are here because he was everywhere. You thought you were descended from fearless warriors or humble farmers or simply the result of random genes. Sorry, history is not always random. Sometimes it is imposed by sword, by blood, and by the complete absence of every rival gene. Genghis Khan did not need to know who you are. But you just by existing prove that his strategy worked. And here comes the part that chills the spine. You carry that segment of DNA not because he reproduced more, but because he eliminated everyone else who could. Not because he was good. Not because he was great, but because he won by ensuring no one else survived to tell a different story. We were not born from an empire. We are software running on the genetic code of an empire. An empire that needed no map, no capital, no army. As long as its DNA remains present in someone's cells, it has never truly fallen. You think he is just a line in a history book? Wrong. He is the background script running inside the bodies of millions of living, breathing people. People who eat, fall in love, and click I agree on genetic testing apps. And whether you live in New York, London, Istanbul, or Almaty, if you carry even a drop of that blood, you are carrying Genghis Khan's greatest political weapon's self-replicating descendants. That does not make you special. It makes you a statistic. A single data point in a massive probability equation. The result of a genetic conquest, not a legacy. A residue. The real question is not, do you carry Genghis Khan's DNA? The question is, did he somehow predict that centuries after his empire vanished, the only thing left standing would be his genes? If so, then he was not just a warrior. He was the first genetic engineer in human history without a microscope. We often say history is written by the winners, but with Genghis Khan, the winner, rewrote the genes of the losers. No monuments, no national anthems, no flags, just a DNA test result. And sometimes you look in the mirror and see nothing unusual. But in your spinal cord, in your pituitary gland, in every strand of protein, there is a memory that does not belong to you. It belongs to him. And it does not need your permission. This is where the story ends or restarts, depending on whether you see genes as the past or the silent summons of history. You do not have to believe it. You just have to test for it. And if the result is positive, congratulations. You have just met your political great-grandfather. His name was Temujin, but you can call him something else. Founder. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the very end of this story. If you have listened from beginning to end, it means history has already touched your curiosity. But do not let the journey stop here. Hit that subscribe button so we can keep unlocking even more secrets from the past together. And do not hesitate to leave a comment. Which detail impressed you the most? I read every single one. Get ready. The stories coming next will be even more surprising, even more captivating.